In 2005, I made a DVD called Knowing the Score. It had become my firm conviction that the particular expressive markings of many of our most important composers of the past were simply no longer properly understood. It's been a lifelong pursuit of mine to learn to read earlier notations for their full meaning. As a pianist who performs on a variety of pianos, as opposed to those who play exclusively on the Steinway model, there was also some mention and demonstration of earlier pianos and their different expressive possibilities.
We have entitled the present DVD, Performing the Score. If, for example, we can now read Beethoven's indications properly, how can we realize them? And just how important will instruments be in our realizations, both individually and in ensembles? These will be the subjects of the present video.
Once, when I felt I had really played my best in a concert and was feeling rather pleased with myself, a colleague came up to me and said, "Malcolm, one cannot play better than that, but one can play differently." I understood this for exactly what she meant it to be, a genuine compliment. The greatest works requiring performance, music, plays, orations, etc., all the way from ancient Greek tragedy to large 20th century orchestral compositions, can be brought to life in many different ways. For if they are truly great, they possess meaning on a variety of levels, and in greater measure than do second-class works. Nevertheless, it's generally accepted today, and certainly by both of us, that the closer one gets to what inspired the playwright or composer, and the more levels on which the performer understands the work, the deeper and more comprehensive the performance will be.
From roughly 1780 to 1880, three important transformations in musical composition and performance took place. Musical language changed from a rhetorical speaking style to a much more continuous singing legato style. Public performances went from small concert rooms to larger concert halls, and to this end, instruments changed, often radically so, to keep up with these developments. Some, like the members of the string family, were simply modernized, souped up, and of course acquired different bows to better accommodate the new aesthetic. Others, like most of the wind instruments, were expanded, got more keys, etc. No instrument, however, changed as much as the piano, becoming something so different from its earlier counterpart that many people, when seeing an early piano for the first time, confuse it with a harpsichord. A Baroque violin, by contrast, is virtually indistinguishable to the untrained eye from a modern one. Another phenomenon is important in our story. Roughly around mid-19th century, we see the emergence of the independent virtuoso. These are first and foremost players, although most still composed and performed their own pieces, along with music of others. In earlier days, Mozart and Beethoven, along with lesser-known composers like Tomaszek, Kramer, Hummel, for example, had been composers first and performers second, with their principal public appearances being in their own concertos and in improvisations.
Piano sonatas, along with piano-violin sonatas and piano trios, were house music for the salon and the drawing room, not for public venues. But in 1839, Franz Liszt gave a revolutionary series of 12 solo piano recitals in Berlin, only himself on the stage, no orchestra, no chamber music, no singers. He played not only many of his own works, but Beethoven's sonatas, including the Hammerklavier, although probably not all of it, Mozart, Scarlatti, etc. The piano recital then just took off in the 1840s with such virtuosi as Sigismund Thalberg, Anton Rubinstein, Clara Schumann, etc. All of these were, however, still composers, as were even later Arthur Schnabel and Ignaz Paderewski. New was that they were pianists first, composers second. In the mid-20th century, Rachmaninoff and Bartók were still earning most of their income from being piano virtuosi, not by their compositions. Now, by the beginning of the 20th century, piano recitals would normally include repertoire rarely heard today, paraphrases of opera arias, sets of original variations on famous tunes, etc., everything designed to show off the virtues of the virtuoso. Beginning in the 1920s and 30s, however, it was not only concert programs that changed by building around a more serious piano repertoire, but attitudes towards the compositions themselves. A work was no longer to be considered merely as a vehicle to show off the performer, but as a work of art to be respected and studied and rendered as faithfully as possible to a public who deserved the best interpretations. And after the Second World War, we begin to see the advent of that scholarly edition, the so-called Urtext, attempting to impart to performers as closely as possible the composer's intentions as set down in autographs and first editions.
This interest in Urtext editions arose from the recognition that the many highly edited editions from the past simply reflected specific interpretations of particular players. These Urtext editions naturally led to increased scholarship, exploration of 18th century sources, instruments, treatises, etc. It is now almost universally recognized that performance practices and instruments changed considerably across the 19th century, and that each change brought with it some new aesthetic values, while leaving others behind. One might say that in the last half-century, performance has been working to catch up with scholarship. Yet, it is mainly in the orchestras that we see these realizations represented most concretely today. The advent of period instrument orchestras in the 1980s that revealed so many previously hidden facets of the musical language, from Haydn to Brahms, has had a marked effect on how the New York, Berlin, or Vienna Philharmonic orchestras approach this music. And many of today's most important conductors, like Simon Rattle or John Eliot Gardner, work with both types of orchestras, so there is a great deal of cross-pollination. This will be discussed more by Sir Nicholas Kenyon, Managing Director of the Barbican Centre in London, Europe's largest multi-arts centre.
Now, what is it exactly that we are talking about here? What is performance practice? The example I often use is that we know from early recordings and other documentation that Joseph Joachim, Brahms's violinist, used very little vibrato, reserving it for emphasis of particularly expressive notes. So if a violinist decides to play Brahms' violin sonatas without much vibrato, this is called performance practice. But any violinist playing with constant vibrato is also engaging in a form of performance practice. Everything we do is performance practice. The length and the loudness of the notes we play, the rhythmic inflection, the articulation, etc. And these performance practices can often be far more important for clarifying the proper musical message than something as superficial as whether or not we vibrate.
And yet, for that very violinist wishing to emulate Joachim, a major problem arises. One cannot play expressively through a process of subtraction. If he or she begins to play with little vibrato, what replaces the warmth and fervor that we normally associate with the vibrato sound? The reason either of us would want to adopt the different parameters of earlier eras is that we firmly believe that the closer we get to the aesthetics of the composer, the closer we can also get to the deeper expression of the music. Simply removing something that has been part of our expressive modus operandi since childhood, without seeking that greater expression and passion, will get us nowhere. This is where serious study and deep commitment come into play. For unless these new, old parameters are absorbed into the blood, as it were, to produce deeper insights, we will remain on the fringe at best. But in the hands of the most talented and brilliant young players on the best possible instruments, it can become a great adventure. The extra feature the brilliant young forte pianist Christian Bezuidenhout, who is presently the most sought-after forte piano soloist for concertos.
In my earlier video, Knowing the Score, virtually all the examples were taken from the solo piano repertoire. Yet I have always been a passionate chamber music player, and it is clearly as a partner to voices and especially to string instruments that the particular attributes of any piano increase greatly in importance, providing either a help or a hindrance to the ongoing musical dialogue. This was the inspiration for the present DVD, which will consider the distinctive worlds of pianos and violins and ultimately how they interact with one another. In 1976, I gave a concert in Boston on a 5-octave fortepiano very similar to the one I'm sitting at here. The review by Michael Steinberg in the Boston Globe predicted that by the year 2000, most piano recitals of Mozart and Beethoven would be given on such instruments. This prediction, as you may have noticed, does not seem to have come to pass. Yet Steinberg was remarkably prescient. A change did occur, albeit elsewhere, in the world of the orchestras. Starting with the landmark recordings of all the Mozart symphonies in the late 1970s, virtually all the important repertoire of the 18th and 19th century has been played and recorded by period instrument orchestras. And by 2010, conductors like John Eliot Gardner or Simon Rattle were bringing these historically informed concepts to modern instrument orchestras such as the Berlin and Vienna Philharmonics. Principles of bowing, articulation, tempo, vibrato, etc. are now trickling down to modern instrument players everywhere. Everywhere, that is, except to pianists. What I will endeavor to elucidate in this segment of our program is that the expressive markings of the late 18th and early 19th century are largely ignored by most pianists today, and that many of these markings are either not realizable on Steinway-type pianos or will sound unnatural at best and are generally avoided. This point of view will doubtless seem excessive to some of you, but please don't switch off your DVD player just yet. Bear with me for just a bit for some explanations, after which you can still decide whether what I say is unwarranted or not. Now, composers write for instruments. We know, for example, that both Mozart and Verdi changed the aria when a singer with a different voice appeared. In 1994, I and 6 young colleagues played all the Beethoven sonatas on period pianos in New York and a few other places, the first time in history, actually, that had been done. I found myself astounded at how Beethoven radically changed his piano writing style as the instruments changed and got bigger. Many music schools and conservatories now have some sort of early piano, yet many of these remain unused. And in my opinion, this is quite easily understood. Most pianists will try them out and simply find them wanting. It's not just that they are far less loud than their modern counterparts, but anyone used to the expressive qualities of the Steinway type will find them inexpressive, stiff, and inflexible. And indeed they are, if one tries to get out of them what we all strive for as modern pianists. Most importantly, a long singing legato line. Last spring, I gave a concert on a 5-octave Walter-type piano at the Boito Conservatory in Parma, Italy. The day after was free, and I needed to practice some Mendelssohn, Chopin, and Schumann for a concert 3 days later in Vienna. That concert on an 1830 Andre Stein Viennese piano. I had learned all these works on a similar Viennese piano from the 1830s that I have in my music room at home. The Conservatorio kindly lent me an office where there was a very fine Yamaha Grand, yet I was at least as frustrated playing on that instrument as the Steinway pianist mentioned above would have been on the Walter. Almost everything I wanted to do expressively was severely compromised. All the fine nuances I was used to were simply not available, and I found myself playing inexpressively, stiffly, and inflexibly. Now, at this point, many of you will really want to switch off the DVD. Is this lunatic trying to suggest that a Bösendorfer or a Shigeru Kawai is less flexible and less sensitive than an 1830 Graf or Streicher? Not in the least. What I am suggesting, however, is that those instruments are flexible and sensitive in very, very different ways from the earlier pianos. And that is just where the whole question of instruments becomes interesting. Now, in order to talk about different kinds of pianos, we must first define what a piano is altogether, any kind of piano, and only then try to talk about how they might differ in construction and expressive possibilities. The piano was invented around 1700 in Florence by a man named Bartolomeo Cristofori. Cristofori wanted to render the harpsichord more flexible, so instead of the plucking mechanism of the harpsichord, he constructed a hammer mechanism. Cristofori's piano action was actually very sophisticated and established the basic principles of every piano action since. The hammer must be brought up close to the string and then fall back through what we call an escapement mechanism. If the hammer were to reach the string, it would block, preventing the string from vibrating. It's a little bit like ringing a bell. You strike the bell and then you back off to allow it to ring. You don't do this. Now, it's important to understand that Cristofori's invention, which he called gravicembalo che fa il piano e forte, harpsichord that plays soft and loud, was essentially striving for a softer dynamic possibility. Harpsichords play loud. That is, the plectrum is set to give the full voice of the instrument, not half or a third. And it was these softer effects that Cristofori was after. All piano sound, then, consists of three parts. There is the attack, wonderful English term for it, like the consonant with which most words begin. Then there's the ringing part of the tone, corresponding to the singer's or the speaker's vowel sound. And finally, the end of the tone, either because it just dies away or because the damper descends on the string to stop it. Anyone familiar with many different types of pianos from different periods will attest to the utter astonishment at realizing just how many different kinds of recipes there can be, treating each of the three parts of the sound in an individual way. The attack can be with a hard hammer or a soft hammer, a large hammer or a small hammer. The ringing part can consist of a rather slow development of the tone or a rather rapid decay. The dying away, in some ways perhaps the most important variable, can be long or short, depending not only on what kind of piano, but obviously varying throughout the registers of any piano, shorter in the treble, longer in the bass. Finally, the damper can work more or less efficiently, and the particular type of piano can have some sort of after ring built into it to varying degrees as well. A further characteristic of any piano is due to what we call the scale. This involves the stringing, including obviously the type of wire used, the length, the layout of the strings, the soundboard, its support, etc., etc. This is what makes two pianos of the same essential design sound different. In 1880, a Steinway versus a Bechstein. In 1780, a Stein versus a Walter. The variety in the possibility of piano sound production is, to put it mildly, simply staggering. Franz Liszt loved pianos, and when he started playing solo concerts in the 1840s, he always wanted to use whatever piano was there. He owned about 20 pianos. He endorsed 60 pianos. American pianos, Russian pianos, Hungarian pianos, German pianos, French pianos. And for Franz Liszt, he would find it very, very strange that today, 95% of the world's concerts and recordings are made on one brand of piano. He would find that very strange, and so do I. Now, this is by no means meant to be even a short history of the piano. Rather, we will look at a few types and show their differences. I always like to begin with the Steinway type, with which most of us are familiar. Yet the important features that are peculiar to the Steinway type are rarely understood by the public, nor even by many players. You might notice that I never say the modern piano, always Steinway type. It was the Steinway Company in the United States in the 1860s and 1870s that brought together several features that already existed in other pianos at the time to come up with their own new recipe. String tension supported by a complete cast iron frame, with the bass strings crossing over the tenor strings. Erard repetition action. Large hammers covered with felt, a crowned soundboard with the grain running from treble front to bass rear. It's worth noting, by the way, that while the Steinway created a sensation at the World's Fair in Paris in 1862, there were many pianists at the time who strongly objected to the ruined bass caused by the cross-stringing. Certain pianists, among them the great American virtuoso Louis Moreau Gottschalk, refused to play on the Steinways, choosing instead the straight-strung chicory for his concert tours. And in 1875, a book by the very important German builder Blüthner gives Steinway high praise, yet calls the cross-stringing unnatural. Cross-stringing was at the time very controversial, and to my mind it still is. And we will see some examples of the problems that I feel it causes. Yet by the end of the 19th century, both Chickering and Blüthner had, along with virtually all the other builders, adopted the Steinway recipe. And all pianos since that time have been built along these lines. There are no exceptions to this recipe in any important pianos. It is absolutely universal. Characteristic of this type of piano is a slow developing tone with a very rich fundamental and a quite long sustain. If you listen carefully, it actually goes up. In addition, the bass register of cross-strung grand pianos have a very peculiar tonal quality that sets it off clearly from all previous pianos. Now this 1795 Schanz replica by Thomas and Barbara Wolff is a piano that Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven would have recognized. Characteristic of this type of piano is a somewhat harder attack, a singing tone with complicated overtones, and a rather rapid decay. This is tuned a little lower. So you hear a kind of pop, dee. It sings, but it doesn't go dee, it goes dee. Let's talk for a moment about the decay of tone of various pianos. The decay of sound is the single most important attribute that sets all pianos apart from any other instrument. A violin, a clarinet, a cello, or a bassoon, and of course the voice, control the sound completely from the beginning to the end, either swelling towards the middle or at the end, dying away gradually, suddenly, etc. T, T, T. But with pianos, and harpsichords as well to be sure, but we're not concerned with them here, the decay of the note is set at the factory and varies enormously with different types of pianos. Now, generally speaking, pianists don't like the decay of sound very much, and indeed, the most admired pianists today are generally those who hide that aspect of the piano most successfully, who make the piano sing like a human voice. And so we think of a piece like this. And indeed, this is the kind of thing that a piano like this does very, very well. Yet, the decay of tone remains the defining expressive attribute of any piano. And the greatest pianists and the greatest composers of every period have known how to exploit this to greatest advantage. Now, it'll be obvious that the slower the decay, the easier it will be to simulate such a long line, with each note appearing to be connected tonally to its predecessor. On the other hand, the more rapid the decay, the easier it will be to show fine inflections between notes. And these differences are easily to be seen in the compositions of the great piano composers from different periods. In 1969, a young piano builder named Philip Belt wrote me a letter that he had built a Mozart piano. It was an instrument very similar to the one that I'm sitting at here, a 5-octave piano, and he wanted to take it around to conservatories and to music schools to demonstrate. So I wrote back and said, oh, I would love that, and if you leave it for a week, I'll give a concert. Well, he brought the piano, and I have to say that I was a little bit discouraged at the beginning. It was extremely light to play. It wasn't at all what I was expecting, which was something, how should I say, mellower and sort of sweeter than the Steinways and Bösendorfers and Yamahas I was used to. And here was this light thing, and it was very hard to handle. And of course, these are completely wrong kinds of hands for a piano like this, which has a smaller keyboard than a modern piano, a smaller octave. But nevertheless, I had already advertised the concert, a Mozart concert, of course, because it was a Mozart piano. And on this concert, I was playing the C major sonata. And it was during that week that I suddenly realized that I was playing what Mozart wrote. And this is what I would like to demonstrate for you now. This is the second movement of that sonata. Now, you see the score here on the screen, and what do you see? You see the notes that Mozart wrote, but that's only a part of what he wrote. He wrote Andante cantabile, he wrote a time signature, he wrote dolce, but more than anything else, Mozart's music is always very, very clearly articulated with these little, what we call slurs. It is these slurs that tell you what the music is about. And I would like, for a moment, to go through every one of them. Now, first of all, it is Andante cantabile. Cantabile, according to the sources, means it should be slightly slower than a regular Andante, and that's fine. But this is in 3/4, and that means that anybody who plays that is playing the 8th note as a beat, and it's not. So when we see this slur over these 3 dots, it is perfectly clear that it is the second one that is important. Da, 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 da. It certainly isn't da, 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 or anything like that. Then we have this. Then we have this. Now, before I go on, let's look at this a moment. It's not a very interesting rhythm in this piece. Da 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 dee da 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 dee 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 da, etc. I mean, what composer would write something like that? Well, let's look again. But then you have. This is highly expressive. You cannot, fasten your safety belts a little bit, you cannot play, sing, da-dee-da, at the same speed as da-da-da. Of course you can. Every source in the 18th century tells us we must go faster and slower according to what is going on in the music. So you have da-da-da, and then you have da. Now, what happens here? That is an appoggiatura? An appoggiatura is a dissonance that resolves to a consonance. An appoggiatura must always, not may, but must always be preceded by a silence in order to be expressive. Da 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 ti dum. I could go on. Da 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 ti dum. I could become ridiculous. Da 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 ti dum is ridiculous, but anybody in the 18th century would think that da 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 di da is completely devoid of expression. So you have then you have forte going up. Why is it forte? Because somehow I feel some energy, so of course this has to go faster. And finally, now you've got the notes you started with, but if these were dolce, this is ta 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 ta, has some enthusiasm. All of this is absolutely clearly marked by Mozart in this score. Let me just play it. Well, I had never heard anybody play that on a modern piano. Let me try to do that on this nice Steinway piano. Nobody would do that. What's wrong with it? Some of you might say, well, this is unfair. He's not doing it very well. I'm not doing it very well. If anybody has one of these pianos at home, please try to do it. There's a very good reason why you can't do it. The Steinway piano, about which we spoke before, when they were putting this recipe together in the 1870s, this is the last thing that they wanted any piano to do. They wanted pianos to play these long, uninterrupted lines. And when you play, it just sounds like because of the slow developing tone of the Steinway. When you bring the damper down, it sounds like a hiccup. And so nobody does it. Now, when I'm giving a talk normally in a conservatory or music school, I always like to play recordings. And so I try to hide who's playing the recording. I don't think it's a good idea for one pianist to say, here's pianist X, look, he's doing it all wrong. The fact is, nobody plays anything but a simple legato. And no matter whose recording I take, and no matter how much I try to hide it, there's always somebody who says, what's he doing? He shouldn't be doing that. Well, I finally found a recording that I really am happy to play for you myself. In 1965, on a Steinway piano, when I was a graduate student, and it's a very nice recording from a live concert. Not only am I playing everything smooth, but I'm clearly playing ba, ba, ba. I'm playing eighth notes, not quarter notes as Mozart asks for. And just to put this in some sort of perspective, here's another recording of a very famous Mozart player of today. It's really quite similar. I promised that I would go through a few examples that show why the cross-stringing of the Steinway is so problematic. Here is the Mozart C minor fantasy. It begins this way. Now, well, this is clearly a very, very different, tonal world, but there's something even more problematic about it, and that is that Mozart wrote FP, forte piano. And what this is about is that this note comes D and goes away, and that is the drama. And that doesn't happen over here because the tone is too long. Now this, of course, is the inspiration for Beethoven to write his so-called Pathetique sonata. Now we have the added problem. This is a very good sounding chord on a piano like this. There are 7 notes here. You can hear all of them. Nobody writes a chord like that when the piano got its cross stringing. And so I'm still waiting. I'm still waiting for this sound to die away. You know. The other thing, another example of where I believe Beethoven would never have written for a piano like this, in this manner, in Opus 31, number 3, E-flat sonata. He first plays well. Nobody writes for a piano like this in that range. And in the middle part, in the development section, then he writes. Utilizing every part of this instrument. And it's totally, completely out of the possibilities of writing for an instrument like this. Now, when Elizabeth Field and I go through the first movement of the Mozart B-flat violin sonata K378, we will get into much more detail about lengths of notes and articulation marks. But it's important to understand that those editions now in such disfavor from the late 19th century, Hugo Riemann, Sigmund Lebert, etc., changed Mozart, Haydn's, and Beethoven's articulation marks into what they called phrasing marks. But articulation and phrasing are not at all the same thing. Mozart and Beethoven never used slurs to denote phrases, but rather to denote proper declamation of the phrase. Finally, to conclude, I would like to show you the first edition of 2 pieces that I learned recently. One by Dussek, the Farewell Sonata in E-flat major, 10 years before Beethoven's Farewell Sonata, and the Sonata in A-flat, Opus 26 of Beethoven. Now, you will see, here is the Allegro from the first movement of the Dussek. Not a single slur or articulation mark is here. Now, of course, I can't play it. I also can't play it. So, what I play, which I think is all right. Dusek's music is full of all kinds of words, con passione, and he has fortissimo and pianissimo right next to each other, but no slurs. Now, if we look at any piece, basically, of Beethoven, there's not a single note that is not cared for with these articulation marks. Look at the right hand. That's very, very clear, right? You have two notes under a slur, and the third beat is, of course, short. Now, what about the left hand? Well, the viola, because this is very much like string quartet. How long is the bass line? I don't think so. Is of course what you would play, because this is getting lighter towards the end of the measure, and therefore this would not be too long. It's also 3/8. It's not 3/4. There is here, it's a little hard to see, a sforzando with this mark, which is always a sign of taking time. Then you have a crescendo. It's not only that this is very, very clearly marked by Beethoven, but it's not completely natural. This is not just a walk in the park, It's not just a nice tune, which the notes could be. Now, I do not know any recordings on a Steinway piano that are not legato. This is unknown to me. I don't know if you can do it on a modern piano. The modern piano, as we were saying before, is absolutely designed not to do these kinds of things. But the question that I would like to leave you with is, would these modern performances of this piece be recognizable to Beethoven?
You may be wondering, why am I playing the Sibelius Violin Concerto in a video about 18th century performance practice? The reason is that it is an important part of my journey, how I, a classically trained modern violinist, come to find myself standing here talking to you about playing 18th century repertoire on period instruments. My story begins in 1987. This violin was my world. I was living in New York City, freelancing and preparing orchestra auditions, working very hard on the Sibelius Violin Concerto, practicing several hours a day on my beautiful Carlo Giuseppe Testori violin made in 1703. So one day when a friend brought over a Baroque violin that looked something like this, my first response was, well, it looks like a violin. It didn't look unusual. The only unusual thing, or the most unusual thing, was that it was brand new. And I had a violin from 1703, so didn't I have a Baroque violin? I did notice that it was strung with raw gut, and that the bow was a little peculiar. It was a straight, uncambered stick with a pointy head and a very thin ribbon of hair. But I did what any red-blooded violinist would have done in this situation. I attacked the instrument with the full force of the Sibelius Concerto. Now, I'd thought about reenacting that moment for you, but frankly, it's really too painful. Anyone who's tried this will understand what that moment was like. The shock was immediate. Firstly, there was no shoulder support, let alone a chin rest. So I was confounded not only by how to hold the instrument, but how to shift and play in high positions. Secondly, my vibrato, of which I was always quite proud, sounded nothing less than comical. Ooh. I could make a sound with the gut strings, but any attempt to push the sound into the room resulted in a choking and unmusical growl. My attempts at realizing the Sibelius Concerto on this violin were tremendously frustrating, and it became absolutely clear that this was a very, very different animal than my test story. So I shook my head and returned the violin to my friend and went back to work. But over the next 6 months, as I played in several different chamber orchestras, we played a lot of 18th century repertoire. We did a lot of Bach, Haydn, and Mozart. I began to form some questions. If, in fact, that funny little violin I had tried was really an accurate reproduction of an 18th century instrument, then wasn't all this repertoire that I was playing written for that instrument? And wasn't this then the equipment with which our greatest Baroque and classical composers were familiar? I wondered how different would their music sound when played well on that instrument. I imagined that those composers probably even made compositional choices based on what those instruments were capable of. And could this raw gut sound be beautiful in a way that I didn't understand? And was there in fact another entire aesthetic that I was unaware of? Lastly, how could it be that my 300-year-old instrument was modern while this brand new shiny thing was Baroque? The last question was the easiest to answer and was resolved by simply looking closely at the instrument and doing some minimal research. I learned what is common knowledge now, but what I had no idea about in 1987, that of course my testore had been built as a Baroque violin and had of course been strung with gut, and for the first 100 years of its life had been played with a pike's head Baroque bow and a classically styled transitional bow. I learned that around 1800, along with most stringed instruments in Europe, it underwent a modernization process. The straight necks, originally nailed into the body of the violin, were removed and replaced by thinner necks angled and set into the instrument on a new block of wood inserted into the body of the violin. I like to call this open scroll surgery. The graft is plainly visible. Any of you who have old instruments can see it very, very clearly on your instrument, that the scroll does not belong to the neck, but the scroll does most often match the body. In addition to the neck being removed, all the resonating fittings were changed. Inside, the bass bar was removed. It was made larger. The sound post, the bridge, the bow was redesigned. The bow changed from being a straight stick to a cambered stick with more weight at both ends, the tip evolving into the now familiar hatchet head shape. All this served to increase the tension on the instrument and transform it from an instrument which made its tone primarily from resonance to one that could project in a large hall. The question is then, were these improvements? For about 2 centuries, they were certainly considered to be improvements, and there is no doubt that the instruments became louder. But in retrospect, we see that the increase in volume and projection came with a hefty price. The instruments, in their original condition, were perfectly suited to the resonant venues in which they were used, churches, court, ballrooms, etc. Not only that, they behaved in very distinctive ways, and these instruments were the vehicles on which composers expected their music to be performed and brought to life. The early violin and bow, in some ways, was a simpler instrument in its original form. The physics of its tone production are based on resonance rather than projection. However, make no mistake, the music and expression from the 18th century are as multidimensional as from any period and demand the same amount of personal input. Another question, would Mozart have loved a modernized violin? Perhaps, but I think it is presumptuous to answer for him. Surely we need to understand that as a composer, Mozart would have written for the forces that were available to him. We can suggest, and I believe this, that he might have written his music differently for modern instruments if they had been available to him. But I also believe he would not have thought his music was ill-served in his present day and that it would only sound perfectly realized 250 years after his death. So what makes much more sense than to consider the changes that occurred in instruments as improvements is to consider them to have been adaptations to changing musical styles and tastes. Otherwise, we might have to assume there was an analogous forward progression in composition. Beethoven being better than Mozart, Brahms better than Beethoven, Wagner better than Brahms, and so on. Clearly, Wagner is different than Mozart, not better, and the world would be far poorer without either of them. So what do we know about the early violin? Now there are many wonderful violin bow makers that are making great copies of early instruments. This violin, for example, is a copy of a grand pattern Niccolò Amati. It was made by Carl Dennis. I have Baroque bows and transitional bows, both made by the wonderful bow maker David Hawthorne. But what do we know about actually playing? In the 18th century, several violin virtuosos, including the great Baroque violin virtuoso and teacher Francesco Gemignani and Mozart's father Leopold, wrote tutors on how to play the violin. They gave explicit directions from how to hold the violin and bow to how to interpret various expressive markings. Interestingly, these treatises often disagree with each other on fundamentals of playing. More important than which one of these instructions was correct or even best is the realization that there was no standardization. In fact, the very beauty of it was there was no standardization. Playing an instrument was a highly personal and creative endeavor. Styles were defined by leading regional artists and were constantly molding and flexing. One additional interesting note. The multitude of treatises from the period inform us on the wide range of expressive devices expected of the bow. As in all periods of string playing, the 18th century understood the bow to be the true source of the violin's voice. The left hand is not treated in the same manner. Its function is treated in a much more utilitarian way. This leads us to the all-important topic of vibrato. And I don't want to leave this section without discussing vibrato. On the first hearing of a period instrument group, people often hear a sound that has no or less vibrato than what they are used to hearing from a modern symphony orchestra. I think all string players agree that vibrato has become an integral part of producing tone on a modern instrument, and it is a beautiful device. It helps the tone to rise and shimmer throughout the concert hall. I love vibrato. And for example, I would never consider playing the Sibelius Violin Concerto without this extremely important expressive tool. On an early violin, it is also an important tool, but it takes its place among many others. Gemignani calls it a close shake and lists it as the 14th ornament in a list of all expressive ornaments. If we simply play our modern violins without vibrato and learn nothing else of the vast range of 18th century expression, we are simply subtracting something beautiful and adding nothing in its place. This is the equivalent of, suppose you are a great Chinese chef and you really want to know the secret to good French cuisine, and somebody whispers in your ear, "No soy sauce." You eliminate all the soy sauce from your Chinese cooking. Clearly, this effort will not make the dish more French. It merely ruins a tasty Chinese meal. So one thing really is clear. Expressive playing can never be achieved through modes of subtraction. When we look at a typical page of Baroque music, we can observe some general tendencies and characteristics to the writing. We see dance movements with a paucity of notes, and then in contrast, pages with lots and lots of little black notes, usually 16th notes, that look fast and furious. Sometimes these notes are simply the same note repeated, or are rapid string crossings returning to a common note, and that's called barilage. Or sometimes it's just scales and arpeggios. And then we have melodies that don't look like melodies at all. The notes seem pretty enough, but look chopped up and unvocal on the page. As it turns out, there was a clear language of Baroque composition which perfectly fit the instruments which it was written for. And there are a few shared fundamental principles that help make sense of this notation. First off, the treatment of the up bow is a key factor in understanding 18th versus 19th century style. The up bow is often not an upbeat to the down bow, but instead it is a response to the down bow as a rebound gesture, rather than as a new impetus. One gesture engenders two notes, much like dropping a ball on the floor and having it rebound from the floor with no additional effort. In this way, an up bow is often not a new bow with a new inflection. The acclaimed Baroque cellist and early music scholar John Schuh has coined a term for this rebounded up bow, and it's called a multiple bow gesture. Schuh states, a multiple bow gesture occurs when one gesture is spread over two or more bows. This gesture always starts with a strong note and ends with a jeté. A jeté is a release note, so you can do, this is a two bow gesture as we learned. We can do three bows. We can do four bows. We can do six. We can do 8. Now we don't always have to do them on the same note. We can even do a whole scale. We can even do two scales. Now, it's not unusual to find rapid 16th note scales in 19th century repertoire as well, but it is unusual to find them unslurred. And this raises the very important topic of the slur. In those treatises, there is an oft stated rule, and it is expressed differently in each one, but we understand that the meaning of the rule says the first note of a slur is the strongest while the others taper. This is an essential expressive tool. However, it is always contextual and can never simply be applied clinically. We must look at the rule, breathe life into it, and ask, how can this information help us get closer to what was in the composer's heart and mind when he set those marks on paper? I personally feel that this rule means that the first note is the strongest in the same way a word beginning with a consonant is articulated, and the rest of the letters follow in its wake. This adds the dimension of articulation at the beginning of the slurred group, and in some cases, as in a series of small slurs, rhythmic nuance. In all cases, though, I believe the notes under the slur must be completely smooth with no use of portato. The slurred notes act as a single gesture. Now that we have a little understanding of slurs and rebound bowings, we can look, for example, to an important tutor from 1738 by the noted 18th century French pedagogue Michel Corrette. It is titled L'École d'Orphée. He provides us with many basic bowing exercises. In this simple bowing exercise, he shows us a rebound bowing, 2 notes and 1 separate. He also shows us a very typical articulation found in a lot of Baroque music, which is 3-note slurs and 1 separate. And he also gives us an arpeggiation etude, in which we understand how wonderfully the Baroque violin bow loved to both do rapid bow changes and also to cross strings easily. So these simple etudes show us multiple bow gestures, rapid bow changes, and also rapid string crossings. Now in that same tutor, Mr. Corrette also shows us coexisting French and Italian styles, which demonstrate the French predilection to dance gestures and the Italian leanings towards a more instrumental figuration. So these are fascinating in my mind. This was written in 1738 by a French pedagogue, and he's instructing the students that at this time you must learn to play both French and Italian styles. And for example, he shows us a minuet, and Mr. Corrette is very generous in that he writes T's and P's under all of his notes. The T means tirer, which means down bow, and the P is pousser, which is up bow. Here is a minuet which demonstrates the French style. If you turn the page, then you see a corrente, which is an Italian style. Another wonderful comparison is he gives us, in fact, what looks like a French overture style. Very different from then when he shows us 2 pages later what the first movement of an Italian piece might sound like. So this is his French overture. And then he shows us an Italian allegro, and I would say, listen to the change from that French style, which is so steeped in dance gestures, to suddenly the instrumental figuration of the Italian style, and also listen for the Vivaldi moment. Everybody hear that Vivaldi moment? These wonderful exercises help demonstrate how diverse styles coexisted in the 18th century and required string players to have a very wide range of bowing vocabulary. So the ability then of the bow to make multiple bow gestures, rapid bow changes, and rapid string crossings can help us begin to decode some of the repertoire displayed earlier. After working on Corrette's bowing page, articulations that may seem awkward to the modern eye are basic tools to the Baroque composer. Another favorite piece is the Vivaldi Seasons. If we look at the last movement of Summer, it looks like an absolute page of black notes. But look at all the wonderful Baroque bowing devices that he uses. He uses the repeated notes along with a linear line. And then simple scales with separate notes. He also uses bariolage. And now my favorite, a 2-bow gesture. It's just a release. And then he uses arpeggios and string crossings. And dramatic scales. This leads back to what we referred to in our introduction as a shift from the 18th to 19th centuries from a more rhetorical style to a singing legato style. What this really means is that it's a shift from music which takes its expression from sung speech to an idea of a more seamless long line. I personally believe the idea of long line is not exclusively a 19th century ideal. It is how we choose to treat and form that long line which is so changeable. The 18th century musician needed to employ all the expressive nuances of speech in their playing. Vowels, consonants, syntax, and punctuation provided the basis of the player's tools to help him execute the limitless palette of this expression. While the player was not always playing the text, it was imperative for the player to think in terms of that palette of expression. So far, I've demonstrated everything on a Baroque violin. Can we transfer any of these idioms onto a modern instrument, as Sir Nicholas Kenyon discusses in his comments in some of the extras of this DVD? This is a crucial point. In the 21st century, musicians have a really tough job. We all have a shared passion for this older repertoire, but we are confronted with difficult issues of translation. In many ways, because the composers we revere and love were such great composers, their music has survived beautifully, being translated into many different performance practices. Who would give up the fabulous performances of Heinrich Schering or Pablo Casals playing Bach sonatas done in the mid-20th century? I, for one, love those recordings. However, there is now incontrovertible data available about how this music was created. To me, it was a hard call to ignore everything about how a composition was made and still imagine I was honoring the composer's intentions. But each of us must make personal decisions on what to do with all this information. My personal journey has taken me to a place where I have worked hard to learn as much as possible and make that information meaningful today. I love to play the Baroque violin, but I also love to play the modern violin, and I am not willing to give it up. I believe a great deal, not everything, of what we learn can be applied to our modern technique. Let's take a piece we all know and love. When I was a student studying with Oskar Shumsky, who was an absolutely wonderful and fabulous teacher and violinist, he taught me to play the jig from the Bach solo sonata in D minor. And I learned to play this way. Now, I don't know if I'm really doing this justice, because when Mr. Shumsky played this in his living room, it was absolutely stunningly beautiful, and I've tried my best. But later, when I studied the Baroque violin, I learned a few things. This piece is in D minor. The violin has open strings, D and A. I learned about the jeté, the released up bow. And suddenly, I could see that the jig might sound like this. Can I do that on my modern violin? If I do it on my modern violin, remember, I don't want to play with methods of subtraction. I want to honor this instrument and play it as well as I can. But I think I can still translate some of those expressive idioms. The first thing is we have to be brave about using our open strings. In conclusion, what would happen if the world had never heard the Sibelius Concerto on the violin it was written for? What if the typical rendition sounded something like this? We might have warmed to that rendition, thinking a newfangled version with a thick vibrato and smoothed out sound was inferior. Now, I admit this negative analogy is a somewhat manipulative attempt to demonstrate how important it is to us as musicians not to reject the study of performance practice. To play the Sibelius at its best, it seems to me that we need to understand the modern 19th century violin. I believe to gain insight into 18th century repertoire, it is extremely important to at least look at the original context and environment in which the music was written. We now would like to hold a kind of open rehearsal, discussing what we see as essential performance questions in the first movement of the Mozart B-flat Sonata for piano and violin, K378. The interpretive questions we discuss will be based on using this forte piano, a replica of a Johann Schanz Viennese forte piano from about 1795. This one was built in 1991 by Thomas and Barbara Wolfe of the Plains, Virginia. And this violin is a copy of a Niccolò Amati grand pattern made by Carl Dennis in 2007. The bow is a copy of a Dodd Kramer-styled bow made by the wonderful bowmaker David Hawthorne. We have decided not to do any kind of comparison with modern instruments, as each of us did in our individual chapters. This is rather to simply show how we would go about studying this music, given the instruments we are using and our study of the sources, etc. If the problems we discuss seem the appropriate ones to you, try them on whatever instruments you have at your disposal.
How does any good composer write for more than one instrument, being inspired by the tonal beauties of each, yet making sure that they balance well when played out full together, and also that the sound of each flatters the sound of the others? Now here, to be sure, we're only concerned with two instruments, one violin and one piano. I have played both violin-piano sonatas by Bartók. There are really no balance problems of any kind, as Bartók understood that violins and pianos were totally different instruments. They simply never share the same material. Each has material appropriate to its characteristics. The same can be said for Debussy, who likewise treated violins and pianos as though from different families.
But Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven treat strings and pianos as belonging to the same family. In both the Beethoven and Mozart piano-violin sonatas, the right hand and the violin are treated as absolutely equal partners. Not only does first one play the tune, then the other, but they play in thirds and sixths, first one on top, then the other. And there is much string trio and string quartet writing in these works, as you will see. And in fact, Malcolm, I think in the beginning, it's very clear that this is a string quartet. And I see four parts with you playing the first violin part. Do you agree with that?
I love playing the first violin. But I think what we have to talk about here is, clearly this is the cello, and these are the two middle strings, right? I think what we have to talk about here is the rhythm of such a bar. Because it clearly isn't bonk-dee-da-dee-da-dee-da-dee, bonk-dee-da-dee-da-dee-da-dee. Why not?
Well, first of all, we have to deal with the issue of the slur. If the slur weren't there, I think you might have a case for that.
What does the slur tell us?
The slur tells me that the eighth notes all belong together.
Yes. Notes under a slur belong together and are always a tiny bit compressed. So that I think you'd agree, the rhythm is not bonk-dee-da-dee-da, but it's bonk-dee-da-dee-da-dee-da-dee, bonk-dee-da-dee-da-dee-da. Why don't we do that with the left hand and the
violin.
Yeah, no right hand, no tune.
So
okay?
No first violin.
Right, here we go, which is me. Okay, now what should I do with the first violin?
Well, I think it would be very sad if you actually try and line yourself exactly with our eighth notes.
Because?
It won't be very expressive.
This is known as?
Rubato.
Yes. Rubato, I think we have to sort of tell folks, Rubato is in the modern, and in some sense in the 19th century, known as getting faster and slower. But both Mozart and Chopin talk about the fact that the right hand or the violin or the flute or the voice have to float while the accompaniment stays steady, but not completely steady. Chopin apparently insisted that the students practice the left-hand part with two hands so that it shouldn't be mechanical, because it shouldn't be dee-da-do-dee-da. So we've got here dee-do-dee. I get to play it later dee-do-dee by myself. What should we try? Let's try where you play the tune and I play. No, let's try the beginning.
Okay,
Here we go.
let's do the
Here we
beginning.
go. Here we go. Okay? Now, when we were rehearsing this, we thought, what about using the pedal? This piano, of course, does not have a pedal, but it does have a knee lever to raise the dampers. Mozart never, ever wrote a pedal mark anywhere. And there are people who claim, perhaps even correctly, that with one exception that I won't talk about now, there's not a measure of Mozart's piano music that can't be played without pedal. There are 3 letters from Mozart to his father, Leopold, when he visited Johann Andreas Stein, the builder in Augsburg, raving about Stein's pianos, and he talks extensively about die Maschine mit dem Knie, the machine that you operate with the knee, and how wonderful it is. So he must have used it. So let's try this with the pedal.
Let's try first the opening. We'll do it once without pedal and once with.
Okay?
Now with.
Play when you play it with the pedal. Now, I think when I play the pedal, you sound better.
Yes.
I think that the piano flatters the violin when I do that, and you seem to play more freely.
Yeah, try without the pedal, as I get too caught into the 8th note measure.
Yeah.
And this is not about 8th notes.
Okay, let's go on. Let's go on to bar 23.
23, okay.
Now, bar 23 has the 2 violins, or the 2 right hands, what do we call them? Up, in.
Right.
Let's play that, okay? Okay, but it seems to me that the real engine of this whole thing is... Let's try with everybody, okay? Yeah, the important thing here is that this composer doesn't write voices that are not supposed to be heard, that are ever suppressed anywhere.
That's right. And I have to say, when I've played this with a Steinway,
Yes?
the pianist, all, out of great respect, has tried to hide that bass line.
We don't have a Steinway here.
Right.
That's very hard to do on a
Right.
Steinway.
And I've always
yeah.
noticed that it's very difficult to play with any kind of energy or musicality when that bass line is kind of muddy. I'm much more excited when I can hear that bass line.
Yeah.
That gives me a foundation to play on.
Well, I think it's what you have in Mozart and Mozart symphonies, that this is, it's a little bit this going on. There's a rhythm that,
That's
that
right.
is...
And what's really fascinating, actually, starting back in 16, he has a continuous usage of 16th notes.
Yes.
That is constantly changing.
And then you play... Yes, and then... And then...
That's right, and don't forget he has us dialoguing them in 25 and 6.
Yes. Now what happens?
Right, now this is wonderful. It's really a recitative moment, I think. Isn't it? And now look at this. I have all by myself and very strange slurring. I have, and then a 2-note, and then, I love that E flat.
Yes. Now how do you want to play that?
Well-
let's play from there, can we? Now somebody might might say, wait a minute, aren't you just taking a big liberty there?
Well, does it seem too free to you?
I think it could be even more free. When I was doing the Mozart concertos with John Eliot Gardner, going through all of them, of course, was a fantastic experience, but I noticed whenever I had a thing like that, where just the right hand was alone, oh, nobody else is playing. We just got finished with something that is unbelievably rhythmic, right? And we're going to go into, can you start right at 30?
30.
Yeah. Now, suddenly, the 16th notes in my right hand have slurs.
That's right. I like when you use the pedal for that.
I think it's obligatory.
And then here...
I mean, I feel so convinced about it, you see. And that is where your little solo there is keeping us in suspense and waiting for what in opera would be a scene change.
Exactly.
Course.
And what's really
see?
fascinating about these articulations that Mozart has written is that there's a comparable place in the recap in measure 134, and the articulation is completely different.
It's shorter too, isn't it?
And 134 is where it is.
No, it's not shorter. I'm wrong. Yeah.
Okay?
It's a little more casual.
It is a little bit more casual, but it's very different. And I've noticed when I play from other editions, they often make them both the same. So I've seen, for example, 29, I've seen this,
Yeah.
which I think is quite sad.
Yes.
Because it... Malcolm, here we have 3 of these. And
Yeah.
piano.
Well, let me play with you.
Okay.
From there? Back to
Yes.
Brilliant 16th.
And they're all different character. And
Yes.
it's really quite wonderful. If you play them all the same, you won't. I don't hear a story.
We wouldn't do that. We wouldn't do
Can we
that.
try? Let's try that again from measure 33.
Wait a second. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
So we're always looking for these differences in character. You know, it's a funny thing when you go to a lot of rehearsals, especially if you're in rush. I don't know if you've had this experience where you play through the melody and then there's something else happens. And then somebody says, "Oh, that's the same as the beginning. Just play it the same." Mm-hmm. And to me, that is a sad moment for me. I never want to play it the same. And I think Mozart is very clear that he gives you clues that he really doesn't want it to be
Yes, of
exactly
course.
the same. It was a,
Yes, of course, that's true.
yeah,
Let's go back to the beginning.
yeah.
Obviously, this first note,
Yes.
you don't need to play. This is just now, when the violin plays, there's a quarter note here because they must stop before this starts. So somebody might say, well, why didn't he write an 8th note? An 8th note, unfortunately, is too light. Mm-hmm. And that is why he writes in the beginning forte and piano. I don't think it's because he wants, but rather that this has to have a certain substance. And since he's coming in with the same hand on the 2nd 8th, he's obliged to write an 8th note there. But here he can write a quarter note. But certainly, it's certainly not this. I hope everybody knows you never, ever hold any note full that doesn't have a tenuto on it.
It's all under this big subject of unmarked notation. That there's so many things that you can't just read completely literally.
You can't read anything literally. Leopold Mozart is very, very clear that you can't read anything unless you know what it is. You've got to know if it's a comedy or a tragedy.
Absolutely.
You know? Mm-hmm. I mean, look, we all speak English, right? But if you and another actress are acting in a play and you think this woman is just, how should I say, a victim of circumstances, and the other actress thinks she's really evil, the words are the same, but you would deliver every word differently. That's the way it's supposed to be. That's what acting is, and that's what this is.
Right.
So Mozart, of course, helps us. I mean, it's allegro moderato that helps us, doesn't it? I mean, if this were presto, what would you do? Right?
Right.
You see.
It doesn't tell us the character.
Let's just look at bar 83.
Mm-hmm.
And this is not so easy for me between what I would call the cello and the second violin, which is what you're playing there.
Actually, it could be viola even.
Yes, it could be. So let's do this without, again, the soprano voice.
Sure. Is that a good length? I'm not quite sure. Perhaps I should be playing a little bit shorter. Let's try that. Can you play the downbeats a little bit longer and the middles a little bit shorter?
Perhaps, yeah. Yeah.
Ah.
But certainly she is not playing anything that sounds like this. Right? Now I have to do this too in a moment. I have different notes, of course, but the principle is the same. Now, what am I going to do with the right hand?
Okay, well, certainly not line it up with my eighth notes.
Let's play it lined up first, okay? Now let's try it again.
Because I get to now have my diva moment.
Yeah, you did fine.
Yes.
You did well.
Oh, thanks.
Why don't we play them the piece?
Okay.
Great, thanks.
Now we're sitting in my living room here in Ithaca, New York, with my young colleague, Nicholas De Eugenio, who is an assistant professor of violin at Ithaca College in your second year now, right? Yes. Nick has an MMA, which is equivalent of a doctorate, plus an artist's diploma, both from Yale University, pretty much the best you can get. And since this is a Chopin and Schumann year, 2010, Nick has played the Schumann A minor sonata for piano and violin, both with Chi-Chen Wu on a Graf replica and with Nathan Hess on a Steinway. And he's going to talk to us about this a little bit, but why don't we listen to the exposition of the first movement in both of these versions first. In a conversation you and I had recently, you were telling me about the experience of playing the same piece with these two different types of pianos. Mm-hmm. Of course, with two different pianists.
Just like so many things in terms of musical choices, within a specific range, it's not so much a matter of better or worse, it's more a matter of different. When you play a piece like the Schumann A minor sonata, a lot of us modern violinists play this piece many, many times. And having at least one of these experiences playing with a different instrument, in this case the Graf replica, it was an opening up of musical possibilities. You get to think about the music in a way that you wouldn't otherwise, because you're hearing physically different types of sounds coming from the two instruments. For me, as a chamber musician, when I'm playing with another instrumentalist, another musician, the sound that they produce absolutely influences me in a specific direction, one way or the other. When I play with a Steinway, the sound often lasts a bit longer when a note is struck. And as that sound accumulates, it gives me the opportunity to maybe use a bit more intensity in the vibrato, or to do a juicy slide somewhere that really feels like the music could call for it, or even to extend a phrase one bar further than one might if you were just looking at the notated slur on the page.
Well, instruments suggest gestures, of course. That's what you're saying.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And with the Steinway, when I perform with the Steinway, as a violinist, the sound of the Steinway accumulates and provides almost, I would like to think of it as a bed of sound over which I can play, sustain, really project. And when I play with the Graf, it affords me even more space to make smaller gestures, perhaps subtler nuances, and I think it's wonderful that we get to explore the different worlds that the music has to offer by playing with the different types of instruments that are out there.
Now I'm sitting with Chi-Chen Wu, who has a doctorate from the New England Conservatory in collaborative piano and who is currently on the faculty of Susquehanna University in Selinsgrove, Pennsylvania, teaching collaborative piano and regular piano. Now tell us a little bit about what happened to you when you discovered these early instruments for the first time.
I was exposed to the fortepianos about 4 years ago. And since then, I have performed several duo sonatas and song cycles with instrumentalists and singers. And I still remember when I just started learning these fortepianos, the first thing I noticed, and I was also told by my colleagues, was that I need to play more. I guess at that time I was still pretty cautious about balance, using skills like voicing and paddling to achieve a good balance. Because as you know, a lot of time when we play those duo sonatas on the modern piano or song cycles, the piano is always too loud. And a lot of time we would overpower our playing partners or the singers we are collaborating with. So I was pretty cautious about that. So when my colleagues told me that, hey, Chi-Chen, you need to play more because we can't hear the piano very well, that was a revolutionary moment for me. I felt liberated and felt that I didn't need to restrain myself. But when I play Bartók or Prokofiev sonatas, I do enjoy playing on the modern piano. I enjoy the resonant and warm sound of the modern piano. So it's just a very different experience for me when I perform fortepianos.
Now tell me, you have a doctorate in collaborative piano from the New England Conservatory.
Yes.
How many different kinds of pianos did they have in the collaborative piano program at New England Conservatory?
Well, they only had one kind of piano for piano students to use, and that's the modern piano. And at Steinway, I think they are pretty proud of having all Steinway pianos offered to piano students. I studied with Irma Valencio, who is a wonderful teacher and pianist. And she taught me a lot of skills to avoid overpowering my playing partners, simply because the sound of the Steinway is very loud. So when we play early compositions like Mozart's or Beethoven's pieces, we have to use those scales and to achieve a good balance.
People watching this in other countries might wonder why we use the word collaborative piano instead of accompanying, as it's called in many places. I suppose presumably because the partners should be equal.
Yes.
Those sonatas of Mozart and Beethoven are, by the way, are for piano and violin, piano and cello.
Right.
And of course, at the time, the violinist was the accompanist, clearly. Well, thanks a lot, Chiche. It's great to talk to you.
Thank you, Malcolm, for having me.
We wanted the viewers to have more than simply our ideas, to bring these subjects into the real world and into a more international perspective as well. I did an interview in London a few months ago with music administrator, editor, and writer on music, Sir Nicholas Kenyon. I have known Sir Nicholas since the early 1980s, when he was a music critic for the New Yorker magazine. On returning to London, he became music critic for The Times, then chief music critic of The Observer. He was editor of the highly influential book Authenticity and Early Music, and founding editor of the journal Early Music. In 1992, Kenyon became controller of BBC Radio 3, and from 1996 was director of the BBC Proms. Since 2007, he's been managing director of the Barbican Centre in the City of London, Europe's largest multi-arts centre. I was also fortunate to, at the same time, get the brilliant young forte pianist Christian Bezuidenhout to participate in the interview. Bezuidenhout, whom I have known since his days as a student at the Eastman School of Music, currently lives in London and is enjoying a busy and well-deserved international career.
I think in the beginning, the historical performance movement came out of a real sense of dissatisfaction on the part of both players and audiences as to what the tradition of performance had become. It had become something very unthinking, very unreflective, and frankly, not very engaging. And along came this group of people who were prepared to take the risks of investigating what old instruments told them, how they made them play, and how they made them make music in a different way. And in spite of the skepticism of the musical profession, and people saying, oh, we need a revival of period strings as much as we need a revival of period dentistry, what actually happened was that audiences became completely enthralled by this. They became completely involved and completely taken up in it. And I think that was the beginning of a process by which, once historical performance had become accepted by audiences, what then happened was that conventional, in quotes, performers suddenly thought, hey, there is something in this which we must investigate and we must respond to. And I think we're in the middle of a very, very interesting, fluid period where that is happening, and it's going in different directions in different areas of practice. Because for some areas, like the orchestral world, it is possible to take some of the insights of historical performance and translate them back onto conventional instruments in conventional halls and to play in a different way. And there would be several examples of that. Here in London, John Eliot Gardner has been working with the London Symphony Orchestra, absolutely taking apart their playing style and putting it back together again. And I suppose the most thoroughgoing example has been Roger Norrington with the Stuttgart Radio Symphony Orchestra, where he has made a whole series of recordings and built a whole period of work on the idea of translating historical performance insights back onto a modern instrument. Now, of course, that's one area of really interesting compromise, but there are other areas where you really need to get in there and involved with the instruments, and there's a perfectly good case for saying that you can't translate what you learn on a viola da gamba to a cello. You can't translate what you learn on a recorder to a modern flute. And I think one of the interesting questions is, can you translate what you learn from a forte piano or a harpsichord back onto a modern keyboard? What I do feel is that absolutely everybody who is engaging with music, whether as a player or a teacher or as a student, ought to go through that process of engaging with the historical original instrument and seeing what they get from it. And it's perfectly possible that at the end of the day, they may say, well, that was quite interesting, but I'm going to do it this way. That was quite interesting, but I'm going to go in this direction. Or they will say, this has given me something absolutely unique which I can respond to personally. I am going to go on playing the fortepiano or playing the harpsichord. I think that at the end of the day is a matter of personal choice, and that's why we're just at such an interesting moment in this whole story.
Chris Bezaden, how did you get into all this?
Well, I think Nick's prelude is absolutely right. There's this sense that in my case, I showed up at university and was a Steinway student and was so disillusioned with the whole sort of factory-like environment. I mean, you had to practice 8 hours a day because that's what you need to become a grand soloist playing Rachmaninoff and Tchaikovsky concertos. On the other hand, there's this sense of frustration because you realize that actually, for me, it wasn't something that was very interesting. I didn't want to play this grand warhorse repertoire. I always wanted to play Mozart and Beethoven, but there was always this basic frustration with the equipment. And the first time I met Malcolm and played on a 5-octave Chris Mahler, just, for fun, from a purely pedagogical standpoint, it was sort of one of those aha moments, epiphany, in the sense that although the instrument was technically very challenging, and the refinement that you need to play a 5-octave fortepiano well, I think is incredible in a sense. There was this amazing sense of freedom, of liberation, of being able to use the piano for all it's worth, and play fortissimo in a way that sounds dramatic and exciting and not overdone. And that in turn gives you confidence to sort of rediscover a relationship with the instrument that is a solo relationship, and a relationship where you can really imagine having a career as a solo artist on this new, exciting, challenging, colourful piece of equipment. And as a modern pianist, that was just really a life-changing moment. And it also gave me the confidence to see that I didn't necessarily just have to be a chamber musician or an accompanist to make a career, but that an involvement in historical performance could be just as rich and fulfilling.
My revelatory moment hearing Malcolm
Yes.
for the first time was, exactly as you say, the feeling that here was an instrument on which the scale of the music made
Yes.
sense.
Yes.
And there was no sense of having to hold back,
Yes.
as you do on a modern piano when
Absolutely.
you play a Beethoven sonata or a Mozart sonata.
Absolutely.
He absolutely went full out for it.
Yeah.
And it showed the instrument at the edges of
Yes,
its capability,
absolutely.
and that's thrilling.
What I can't imagine is a life in which I haven't heard the D minor piano concerto of Mozart 466 on early instruments. I mean, your recording of that piece with John Elliott, I mean, rediscovering the razor-sharp way in which timpani and trumpets cut through the texture, the way the piano can be played fortissimo and not sound overblown and too fat. The drama of those sounds is just... It's unimaginably expressive, and it's something that you can't imagine until you've heard it. And I think it's true with violins and cellos, certainly. I mean, string players, hands down, always agree that playing with any sort of early straight-strung piano, whether it be English or Viennese, is a kind of liberating, opening experience in which their sound doesn't fight against the piano sound, but is complemented by it and is sort of supported in a much more... just a much better way.
Well, you've just been recording with Victoria Muller.
That's right,
have
yes.
you not?
Beethoven sonatas.
And that is a real interesting example of a sea change in a violinist's sound from how she used to play those pieces
Absolutely.
to how she now plays them on a period violin.
Yeah.
So I think the interesting question is, can any of this be transferred back to modern instruments for reasons of commerce, halls, money, size of auditoria and all that sort of thing? Or are we saying, no, that is simply not a good enough representation of what the composer wrote? And I suppose my feeling is that I do enjoy other performances of Mozart's D minor piano concerto, but on the whole, thinking about it, they are probably by pianists who have at least explored what a historical approach might mean,
Absolutely.
and then done something with it.
And also, I think our standards now, from an orchestral standpoint, are so much higher. I mean, even sort of medium-level orchestras have a basic acquaintance with a sort of basic palette of non-vibrato sound.
Yes.
The winds play in a much more soloistic style. You know, often now with modern orchestras, timpani is strung in with calf. There are natural brass. This is so it's a part of our vocabulary now, in a sense.
And I don't know whether you find this as a performer, but as a listener, I find there are all sorts of very peculiar mixtures
Absolutely.
going on. You know, you hear the Mahler Chamber Orchestra, and
Yes.
they're playing with natural trumpets,
Yes,
but,
exactly.
but modern horns.
Yeah.
They're playing with some non-vibrato, some vibrato.
Yeah.
So there's a whole melting pot of styles
Yeah.
going on.
Yeah.
And whether we're ever going to come through this with another mainstream style, I don't know. But what we are very clear about, I think, that the public today, is that there is a whole wealth of different approaches to performance, and there isn't a single performance tradition to which everything else has to conform,
Yes,
as
absolutely.
there was in the old days of the Vienna Philharmonic and Karl Burr.
Right, right.
Well, what about the older days? What about the days of Mengelberg and Toscanini, Rachmaninoff and Schnabel
Yeah.
and Courteau? I mean, it seems to me that when we go back to the 30s, there was much less of a standard.
Absolutely.
And I like variety. I mean, that's part of it. I think if there were 100 recordings of Beethoven piano sonatas on period instruments, I would say somebody should try this on the Steinway. I
Yeah.
bet there's a lot of stuff
Yeah.
you could do with that.
Yeah.
Don't you think?
Absolutely.
What created the standardization then? I think that's an interesting question, because there was enormous interpretative variety, and I think it was possibly something to do with recordings and the demand of recordings and the internationalization
Yeah.
of music making in that way that then led into this really rather dull period of
Absolutely.
homogeneity.
And this is, I think, you know, if we look at post-World War II, this whole period up to now, is why the early instrument music has been so attractive to the listener. Because
I think
suddenly-
the interesting issue now is it students coming into conservatories who have closed minds and closed ears and don't want to try this? I very much doubt that.
I think you're
I
right.
think it's the established forces
Yeah.
who don't want to open up the whole pedagogical process
Absolutely.
to something that might be a little bit threatening.
You're right, and in that respect, the chemistry of the teachers that one has is so important. I mean, if I didn't have someone like Rebecca Pennies as my Steinway teacher,
Yes.
who allowed me to do anything I
Well,
wanted,
she's terrific
she's
and
amazing,
unique.
completely. I mean, she never once felt threatened by any of this. People who have, I think, a deep understanding of and appreciation for the subtleties and refinements of playing on gut strings are realizing that there are wonderful lessons to be learned from that. And also the liberation of working with early keyboards, where there isn't this sense that you have to fight against this monstrously thick and huge piano sound. I mean, when I started doing Beethoven with Victoria, it was almost shocking for her not to have to force her sound. It's something that she had to get used to. And now, in slow movements, I find it's fantastic because she plays so softly. And she has told me that it's something she was never able to do before. That sense of relaxation in the sound and conversing
Yes.
with the keyboard sound.
You
And
get
it-
more flexibility.
Exactly.
Of course, more flexibility.
Yeah.
And interestingly, she now plays like that when she's playing on her own.
Yes,
and she isn't
exactly.
even playing with a keyboard.
Absolutely.
So that her Bach is transformed in the same way.
Yeah.
But isn't there still an issue that for all this openness that we're talking about, the mainstream conservatory practice is still essentially traditional?
Well, that's where things are at their most conservative. I mean, historically, that's where the bastions of conservatism are upholded in the most extreme way. I mean, I find now, sort of being in the field, people are remarkably, not relaxed, but they're very easygoing. They're very appreciative of different approaches to repertoire. They're very interested in different things. Audiences, they love interesting new perspectives and old instruments and strange tunings and weird programs. But it's much harder at conservatory level because you've got people fighting for their turf and trying to defend themselves. And I think early keyboards are arguably very threatening in a sense. I mean, there's a sense of picking up a Baroque violin and saying, well, it's a violin. It sort of basically functions like one. The strings are different, the bass bar's a bit thicker, the fingerboard's in a sort of strange place, but it kind of works like one. But you play a 5-octave forte piano for the first time and it feels like playing a toy piano in it. I mean, you've got these tiny keys, unbelievably refined action. The key dip is almost non-existent. It takes a gram of weight to lower a key.
Oh, yes. And as a quote normal amateur pianist, when I try and play this, my fingers run away with me. It's absolutely hopeless. You know, I would have to spend a lifetime coming to grips with it.
And you know, I think this is a very important point. I remember Malcolm telling me this about my sophomore year when I was running around playing 500 juries.
You were never a sophomore. Sorry, I can't tell.
You know, I was getting into playing the 5-octave instrument we had at the Eastman School, which was a beautiful piano. Yeah. And at a certain point, I was playing Jeune Ami, K271, and I said to Malcolm, look, I really want to study this with you, and I've been doing it on the Steinway a bit and also on the piano. And Malcolm said, you know, this is a really serious piece. There are lots of issues when you play this piece with early instruments even. And he said something to me which I'll never forget, and that is that at a certain point, you have to really start taking this seriously in the same way that Steinway students study for 9 hours a day. And that is about the most important thing that anyone's ever said to me, because there is this sense somehow in which people treat early instruments as a sort of fun hobby. You know, harpsichordists play the forte piano for fun, forte pianists play the harpsichord, they might play a bit of chamber organ. But I think the field now even still needs young forte pianists, let's say, who take the instrument just as seriously as any Steinway artist does the Steinway.
We have been through a period where all this was viewed with great suspicion by the mainstream. And I mean, I think it was a conductor as good as Raymond Leppard who said people only went into early music because they would have had a hard time of it making a career in, quote, proper music. And I think that is an attitude which took a long time to disperse because, of course, everybody was learning on the job. Everybody was learning very visibly by making records, by doing broadcasts, because that was the only economic basis for doing it.
Of course.
And I think one has to say that those people, and this applies to orchestral players as well as to soloists, were taking a big risk at that point.
Monumental, absolutely.
But you can see now with how well established something like the Orchestra of the Age of Enlightenment is, right in the middle of the mainstream, in Glyndebourne, in Covent Garden, that really paid off. And what made it pay off is that it communicated to audiences, and audiences lapped it up.
All pianos built today, whether American, German, Japanese, or Chinese, are based on the Steinway recipe of about 1870. Crossed stringing, full iron frame under enormous tension, large felt-covered hammers acting on steel strings. And it can be somewhat difficult, if not impossible, to discern a difference between the various brands. Can one hear a piano on the radio, for example, and identify it as a Kawai or a Steinway or a Bechstein? Franz Liszt owned some 20 pianos, including late in life both a Steinway and a Bechstein, and endorsed about 60. Liszt loved pianos and knew an astounding variety of instruments with various mechanical and tonal qualities. He would doubtless be astounded at today's standardization, where a single brand of piano is heard in about 95% of concerts and recordings worldwide. Now, I often encounter people who say that they are simply not attracted by the sound of the forte piano. That word was coined about 30 years ago to signify the then emerging reconstructions of late 18th century Steins and Walters. These were made mostly by harpsichord builders, and to contrast them with the standard type of today. In recent years, however, we have both beautiful copies and fine restorations of originals from all the important piano building periods, roughly 1780 to 1870, at which time the Steinway model began to become the standard that all others would imitate. We present here a selection of recordings of some earlier models, recordings that demonstrate other types of beautiful sounds and balances no longer available through the ubiquitous Steinway recipe of today. We begin with an 1847 Pleyel, Chopin's favorite piano in his Paris days, and proceed backwards to two late 18th century models. I had three criteria for my selection. Firstly, the piano had to be, to my mind, genuinely beautiful in its basic sound. It had to be even and well regulated. Secondly, it had to be sympathetically recorded. Pianos of all types are notoriously difficult to capture with microphones, and many piano recordings sound harsh and tinny or simply dull. Thirdly, the performance had to demonstrate aspects of interpretation, balance between treble and bass, between pianissimo and fortissimo, colors and the various registers, etc., simply never heard in performances on a Steinway type. Note, when going from one track to another, that these recordings were recorded in a variety of venues with a variety of recording techniques. This is not meant in any way to be a comprehensive list, merely a short sampling, but please do listen to a track in its entirety to enter fully into that particular world of sound and meaning.